Welcome back to part 2 of the Skelton brothers' disappearance. It's super weird doing it like this, but you guys, there's just so much information. Filming that first part and seeing how long it already was, I knew this was going to have to be split up because that's only 4 pages of a 12-page write-up I have done on this. So anyways, now we are on to the actual disappearance of the boys. If you somehow got onto this video instead of the first one, go ahead and check out the part 1 of the Skelton brothers' disappearance. It describes the backstory of the family and the events that led up to their disappearance. Now, let's jump right on in. So, as I said last video, John still had visitation with the boys despite Tanya having sole custody of them at the time because of the emergency custody order that she put in. Now, they were trying to pin down what to do for the holidays because obviously Thanksgiving was coming up and Christmas was coming up and everything like that. And they decided that John would have the boys Wednesday the 24th of November to Friday the 26th of November at 3 p.m. John originally was not too happy with this setup. He wanted to have more time with the boys. He felt like he just wasn't seeing them enough, but this ended up being the final plan. So on Wednesday, the 24th of November, 2010, John picked up all of the boys, Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner, and everything seemed normal as always. The divorce had been going at this point for about 3 months, and Tanya and John had been going to their counseling sessions, as well as the boys, I believe. And at this moment in time, there seemed to be no real red flags. But later on, Tanya ended up receiving a very strange phone call from John. Now, Tanya does not remember if this phone call came in Wednesday night or Thursday night, which would have been Thanksgiving night. Either way, when John called, he seemed a little bit worked up, and he was very insistent in that moment on knowing whether their marriage was actually going to make it or not. He needed to know, are we gonna end up moving back in together? Why don't we go ahead and do it? Do you still want to be with me? Can we go back to normal? Tanya told him that she had absolutely no idea, that they had only been through 3 one-hour counseling sessions so far. She did not feel confident in their marriage at all, and she said she wasn't sure if it was going to work out. Now, Tanya could hear the children in the background completely fine at this point, so we know either Wednesday night or Thursday night, whenever this call was. I'm sure authorities may have been able to nail it down, maybe. But either way, at this point, the children were fine, and there was no concern despite John seeming to be a little bit worked up. But by Black Friday, everything absolutely changed. It was the 26th of November, 2010. John was supposed to have the boys back to their mom by 3 p.m. that day. That morning, Tanya woke up and she really missed the boys, and she said, you know what, if they're not doing anything, maybe I can go ahead and get them around noon so I can have them a little bit early. So she went ahead and texted John and asked if she could pick them up at noon. John responded back to Tanya saying that they were actually not even in town, which took her back a little bit because she didn't know he had plans to go out of town. I'm sure she was still struggling with the fact that the last time he went out of town, he actually went all the way to Florida. But he claimed he was only about an hour's drive away in Jackson, so right up north in Michigan. He said that they had gone the day before to celebrate Thanksgiving with the Taylor family, specifically mentioning a woman named Joanne Taylor. This wasn't a new name to Tanya at all. John had mentioned this woman sometime between the incident where he took the boys to Florida and this exact moment. He claimed that while he was working as a truck driver, he passed by a family on the side of the highway that had a broken down car. He said he pulled over, ended up being this family that he met, the Taylor family. He helped the husband fix the car, and then he stayed in contact with Joanne online. Tanya even received a friend request from someone named Joanne Taylor shortly after John mentioned this to her, so she found no real reason to worry at this point in time. But as she was processing this information, she just so happened to look outside towards John's house and noticed that his van was still in the driveway. So Tanya got back in contact with John, who now changed his story. John told Tanya that he didn't take his car because the Taylor family came to pick him up because he didn't know where he was going, which was odd because in 2010, there are many different ways you can get directions easily, even on your phone. On top of that, however, he was a truck driver. He was very familiar with all of the local areas, so it seemed odd, but Tanya didn't really want to panic just yet. For the next few hours, Tanya and John continued to text, and he kept bringing up more small details that just weren't making any sense. So Tanya eventually asked him what on earth was going on. And at this point, John said, "Well, I haven't been completely honest with you." John continued on to tell Tanya that he was actually at home, but the boys were in Jackson with Joanne Taylor. He said that he had some sort of housework to do and didn't want the boys to miss out on Thanksgiving. He gave some very strange reasoning as to why he sent the boys there. And he said that Joanne Taylor came down, picked up the boys the day before, gave them a good Thanksgiving meal, they stayed the night, and that she was supposed to bring them back that day. Off the bat, Tanya again wasn't too worried. She had absolutely no reason at this point to believe that Joanne was any sort of threat, but it was really odd to her that John went from wanting more time with the boys over Thanksgiving to not spending Thanksgiving with them pretty much at all. And if he did randomly have housework to do, why didn't he just give them back to Tanya? Because she would have wanted to spend Thanksgiving with them had she had the opportunity. But Tanya kept in contact with John, trying to figure out the details, like when was Joanne going to bring them back? Would they still be back by 3, which was their agreed upon time? Was Joanne going to bring them to his house, or was Joanne going to bring them to her house? But John really couldn't give her a lot of information, and then she got yet another bizarre phone call from him. John called, claiming that he fell while doing housework and he broke his foot and was en route to the hospital. At this point, Tanya is panicking because she's like, okay, John's heading to the hospital. He's the only one that can contact Joanne Taylor. Joanne's supposed to be bringing these boys back, but he can't tell me where. So she's essentially at this point freaking out entirely. So she's trying to ask John for all of Joanne's information so she can get in contact with her so that the boys will successfully make it back home. But John refuses to give her any of this information. Tanya immediately calls her attorney. Her attorney told her to not panic and to wait until a little bit after 3, and if the boys don't show up, that's when she should actually do something. He didn't want her to do anything crazy that could affect the custody or the divorce they had going on. But despite her attorney telling her this, Tanya just had a really, really bad feeling. She decided to call the hospital to try to see if there was any more information that John could give her and to try to figure out information about John himself. Despite the divorce being in the early stages, they were technically still married. So that's how she found out that John did not break his foot doing housework. John had tried to end his own life. And this was all she needed to say, forget it. And she called authorities and reported the boys as missing. Something was absolutely going on here. She raced with her sister over to John's house to see if the boys were actually in the home, because at this point she's questioning absolutely everything that John has told her. But her attorney told her to not go into the home, but her sister did not have to abide by the same rules. So her sister tried to get in through the front door, pretty much every door in the home, but they all seemed to be blocked by something. Then finally 3 o'clock came and Tanya was hoping Joanne Taylor would show up at John's house with the boys, but time kept ticking and she never came and the boys simply never showed up. Larry Weeks was the current police chief at the time, and when he got the call about the boys, he wasn't even on duty. He was off duty at home with his family. They had a ton of family members over. They were sitting down to eat a meal, but he heard the circumstances of the boys' disappearance and he immediately went into the station to try to figure out how to find them as fast as possible. An Amber Alert was sent out right away, and from that second the town of Morenci changed forever, and that is not a dramatic statement in the slightest. The circumstances of the disappearance, what John had originally told Tanya, the fact that he had taken the boys to Florida before, the fact that he ended up in the hospital for trying to end his life, this was enough to have the FBI themselves also plan to be in Morenci by the following morning, and basically every nearby agency that could lend a hand showed up. While dozens of police officers, FBI agents, and volunteers combed endlessly through all the local areas in search of the boys, investigators began to look into Tanya and John. When authorities arrived at John's home, they found a shocking scene. It seemed like every single item that was of any importance to Tanya or Tanya and John's marriage had been destroyed, basically, is the nicest way to put it. Glass was shattered all over the home. Some of Tanya's favorite vases and, things like that smashed to pieces in the sink. Pieces of furniture had been completely destroyed and ripped apart. Their mattress that was on their bed, it looked as if someone had taken a knife and just created tears in it every few inches. This likely was the reason why Tanya's sister could not get into the home, because it was just flipped upside down and destroyed. But there was absolutely no sign of the boys. The community was in shock once word really started to spread, which was very quickly because it was such a small town. Everyone knew everyone, and suddenly 3 kids that had been around that everybody knew just vanished all at the same time, and everyone was confused and concerned, and they just had questions that weren't being answered. Plus, the locals said that they all of a sudden woke up that Saturday morning and it was like their entire community had doubled to tripled in size. Everyone possible showed up and no stone was left unturned in the search for the boys. Authorities seized everything from both Tanya and John, including all of their electronics, and Tanya was questioned by authorities endlessly. Her home was searched top to bottom for signs of the boys. She stuck to her version of what happened, and she was able to show them all of the things that John had said to her. John, at this point, was slowly starting to add in his own version of the story. John began to claim that he gave the boys to Joanne in order to protect them from their mother. John was fully pointing the finger at Tanya, just like he had done in Florida. He told them that it was the only thing he could do to save them, since Tanya had received this emergency full custody during the divorce, and he didn't want the boys to be in harm's way anymore, and because the system had failed him, he said this was his only choice. Now, with the accusation that Tanya was abusing the boys, authorities went from John right back to her. And this was something they obviously had to do, not just because of these allegations, but it was scary because she had a felony charge on her record when it came to abusing a 14-year-old child. They started to search high and low for any sign at all that Tanya had been abusing the boys. They spoke to all of Tanya's friends and family. They spoke to the boys' teachers, to administrators, the secretary, anyone that ever had any contact with the boys or the family, the principal. They looked through the home again and all of the electronics for any sign at all of abuse, but they found absolutely nothing at all to back these claims. They actually found the exact opposite. Everyone they spoke to had nothing but good things to say about both Tanya and John, that they both loved those boys so deeply and would never do anything to harm them. Those boys were so happy and well taken care of. So this turned their eyes back on John, who they knew had recently tried to run away with the boys just a few months prior. Now, I already spoke about the state of his home and that being very scary and questionable, but his electronics brought forward the most horrifying information of all. In his search history from Thanksgiving night, they found searches like, does rat poison kill children? And can you break someone's neck with your bare hands? Those are quite the questions to be searching just a day before your own 3 children go missing from your care. They brought in John for questioning, and he stated that the only reason he had these searches in the computer was because the boys had asked him these questions. He claimed that he watched a movie that night with them and something happened to someone in there that involved them breaking their neck, and the boys asked, so he looked it up. But authorities really weren't buying it. So they decided to go ahead and put a warrant in to make sure they could get all of his location information from his cell phone to hopefully triangulate John's whereabouts that Black Friday. He had gone on an early morning trip the morning of Black Friday. At 4:29 a.m. the morning of November 26, 2010, John's phone was sending off pings about 3 miles away from his house, heading into Ohio. And then 30 minutes later, his phone was sending off pings again in Holiday City, Ohio, which is perfect timing. It takes about 30 minutes to get there, but this indicated that he really took no stops at all on this first leg of the trip. The location itself also wasn't too odd because he was a trucker. He drove to that location quite frequently. Holiday City itself is quite literally the middle of nowhere. It's essentially just a place with fast food, gas stations, and hotels for truck drivers to stop at and take care of whatever they need to do. So he was not only familiar with it because of that, but apparently it also was of some importance to him and Tanya and the boys. I'm not sure if they stayed there one time or what exactly the deal is, but it was an important location for him. But then As soon as the 5 a.m. ping went off in Holiday City, the phone was either turned off or died, and it didn't show back up again until 6:46 a.m., all the way back at John's home. Now that's an hour and 46-minute gap between when he was tracked to Holiday City and when he was back home. Take into account the 30-minute drive it would have taken to get back from Holiday City, and we're looking at about an hour and 16 minutes unaccounted for. Unfortunately, despite efforts, they were not able to further figure out where he could have gone after this. Instead, authorities decided to focus on what he did the second he got back to his house. Apparently, as soon as he returned home, again around 6:46 in the morning, he started to send out texts and emails, and then shortly after that, he started to pack up some of his items and he drove them to a family member's home nearby. Now, it's a very vague memory I believe this family member has, and again, the family's not worked very well with authorities or the media, so we're not 100% certain. But apparently John showed up with all of these items, gave them to this family member, and said something along the lines of, "I won't be needing this anymore," or "I won't be around much longer to use this." The next few hours is when he told Tanya this different slew of stories about where he was and about where the boys were and about Joanne Taylor, and then eventually his attempt to take his own life. Now, desperate for answers, authorities told John that there was a better way he could have acted this out, basically. That if they had been told there was any sort of abuse going on between Tanya and the boys, and if they were then able to corroborate that with evidence, they would be able to put the boys into a third party, someone that John was familiar with, someone that the boys were familiar with, and it would just be a better situation overall. And they really believed John would take the bait, but he said no. He said absolutely not. They're going to stay where they are. And authorities believed the only reason he said this was because either the boys weren't alive anymore or whatever he did with them was very, very permanent. At this point, all roads led to John. John seemed to have all of the answers. He had confessed to authorities already that he handed the boys over to this woman named Joanne Taylor. This woman was now going to be taking care of them because he wanted them to be safe from their own mother. So because he seemed to be harboring information and he just gave away the kids illegally, he was charged with 3 counts of kidnapping and 3 counts of unlawful imprisonment. While John was sitting in jail waiting for his trial, local authorities and the FBI continued to search for the boys, but all they really had to work with was Joanne Taylor and the fact that he had gone to Holiday City. But Holiday City was in the complete opposite direction of where Joanne Taylor supposedly lived, which was Jackson. I'm talking like polar opposites. They started with Holiday City since that's the odd location that John went to at the crack of dawn that morning, but unfortunately it was a very, very rural area, which means that the towers that his phone was pinging off of were like few and far between. It was a much larger area to search out there than it would be inside of a city. So they really had to narrow down the most probable locations that he might have gone and where the boys might be. They had to think about the trucking route he would have usually gone, which route would have been the most convenient overall, and that's kind of where their search areas were limited to. That doesn't mean they didn't search very thoroughly in large areas, but they kind of had to narrow it down at least a little bit in order for it to even be a realistic search to begin with. Every single dumpster was searched, behind every building, every alley, everyone that worked in the hotels, every gas station clerk. They spoke to everyone along the way to Holiday City, but there was absolutely no sign of the boys. But they did admit that by the time they got down there, things like the dumpsters, those would have been changed. Those would have been taken, and there's no telling if there could have been something there at one point, but they just showed up too late. After exhausting all tips and ideas that local police had, they decided to transfer the case into the hands of state police. This is where Sergeant Jeremy Brewer took over. Local authorities were hoping that maybe fresh eyes would see something that they didn't. It was kind of hard to grasp the idea that something so horrific could happen in such a small town where everyone knew everyone and there could just be no evidence at all left behind. The search continued, and more specifically, at this point, they were trying to locate Joanne Taylor. And they'd been trying to locate her this entire time, but it was proving very difficult. No one in Morenci had heard of a Joanne Taylor, which again, odd considering it was such a small community. And then Jackson, where she supposedly lived with her family, no one there knew of a Joanne Taylor either. They decided to double check the Joanne Taylor that had become friends with Tanya over social media, and this is where they found out that Joanne Taylor basically was one giant fabrication. It was all a lie. John himself had been the one to create this Joanne Taylor social media account. So he had been the one to friend request Tanya. He also was the only person that could corroborate the story about the Taylor family being on the side of the road. So based on that, plus the fact that nobody could find a Joanne Taylor in the vicinity, authorities believed that Joanne was probably not a real person. So now the only two real leads they had to begin with, which was Holiday City and Joanne Taylor, neither one worked out. Holiday City, they searched and found nothing, and Joanne Taylor wasn't actually a real person. And along came John's trial, where I'm sure you can guess, yes, he changed his story again. Joanne, who was now proven to not exist, now turned into an organization called the United Foster Outreach Underground Society. That's a mouthful, but now while on trial, John's claiming this is actually who he gave the boys to. While the group or the person or, whoever John claimed he handed the boys over to is consistently changing, the fact that he handed the boys over to someone else and the reasoning as to why were two things that remained consistent no matter what. But up to this point in time, authorities had still not found a single thing that proved that Tanya was abusing the boys in any way. The entire time John was on trial, he just endlessly cried, according to those that were there. And he kept on saying that he had to do it because the system made him and the system failed him. He said if he truly believed he had any other options, that he would have taken them. In September of 2011, John pled no contest to 3 counts of unlawful imprisonment and was sentenced 10 to 15 years in prison. Now, the kidnapping charges were dropped as part of a deal, and he eventually ended up in Bellamy Creek Correctional Facility in Michigan. He was actually in segregation for about 4 years there, and his entire experience in prison, according to his family, was horrible. Now, none of this information was online until the Shattered podcast spoke to John's mother and father, but apparently he was treated horribly in prison. He was in segregation for 4 years straight, which is not something that's very common. But when Shattered went to look at, these possible instances of where he was mistreated, they actually only found 2 different things on his record, and it was him acting out towards law enforcement and the different guards there. But John's family remained at his side during all of this, and they were pretty much the only ones. The first few days of the boys missing, people had their speculations, but no one was trying to point fingers. Everyone was thinking about what was important, which was bringing the boys home. But as soon as little bits of information started to come out, everybody strongly believed that John did something to these boys, that John had not actually given them to anyone, that something had happened to them. And everyone was pointing the fingers at him and pointing the finger at his family. And I understand everyone just wants answers and they want to understand, but people were hounding John's family, people that were not connected to this. I believe it might be because they thought maybe the family was hiding the boys, but that is something authorities will check and, confirm or deny. But the public and the media, they kind of took things into their own hands and destroyed John's family despite there being no proof that they had anything to do with any of this. At one point in time, his family was allowed a short meeting with him. His mother and father both went, and his mom stated something after the meeting because obviously there were cameras there. This was a huge case. It blew up, and what she said was instantly thrown under, speculation. She apparently came out and the first thing she said was, his boys are safe and sound. And she said this very matter of fact, as if she knew it for sure. And a lot of people believed that the only way she would have come out saying this was if John told her where the boys were or if she was in on it or something like that. But when Shattered was finally able to speak to John's mother and father, they stated that they have absolutely no idea where. And she said that the exact thing that John said to her in that meeting was the exact thing she said to the media when she came out, was that the boys are fine and they are safe. She said he did not say where they were. He didn't give her any information. She claimed that if she did know where they were, she would have them by now. But this was just kind of another thing that really threw his family under the bus and pushed them away from speaking to anyone about what happened, which in my opinion is terrible because they know things about John that other people might not, and they could have their own opinion and things to say. And when you don't have the whole story, how could you ever understand? And that was kind of another frustrating thing that people found from when they came out of this meeting with John, is that they said, you don't know the whole story. And a lot of people took that in the sense of they knew what happened to the boys, but years later when they spoke to Shattered, they said that because media took all their words and twisted them, and so they felt they had no choice but to stay quiet. After John's trial, he also had to go again to court, but this time for the divorce, and things got a little bit strange during this. John decided to represent himself instead of having an attorney, and this made things odd. He asked very weird questions. He ended up questioning Tanya herself up on the stand, and he said things like, do you believe the children are safe? Are you okay with not seeing your kids anymore? He even specifically asked Tanya how she knew her husband had anything to do with it, like fully speaking in third person and everything. And it made Tanya uncomfortable and everyone in the courtroom, and his questions just seemed so bizarre. So you can see at this point why this is such a frustrating case, because these three innocent boys got thrown into the middle of what seems like a war between John and Tanya, and then now it turned into a war between John's family and Tanya, and John's family and the media and authorities. It was just a disaster, but the one thing that I remain very thankful for, and I'm sure looking back everyone else does as well, authorities let this crap show happen in front of them, but they kept their attention on finding the boys and figuring out what was going on. They kept all this craziness to the side. They let all this unfold. They paid attention to it. They watched it so very closely to look for hints of anything, but they kept their eye on the real prize, which was bringing the boys home. To this day, authorities are still searching and they are still collecting tips. I believe they have received over 2,000 tips so far and counting. They're still receiving them, but things just keep getting more confusing because John just keeps changing his story. It went from Joanne to this underground sanctuary, and then at one point he said he gave the boys to the Amish or Mennonites or just some sort of religious group. And being near Amish country, this kind of led authorities down that goose chase as well. Shattered decided to go and speak to anyone that would talk to them basically in these Amish communities to figure out if it was even plausible that the boys might be there. It seemed to be pretty heavily agreed on that if the boys had been dropped off in the Amish community, they would have taken care of the boys, but they are still under the same laws and they still would have called authorities to try to figure out where these boys came from. It would never be a situation where they agreed ahead of time to take the boys in and keep them permanently. Plus, they don't have electricity. They don't have internet. How would they communicate with John? And then on top of that, everyone in the community would then know that the boys were there. And it just wouldn't have been a decision John would have made to actually give them to the Amish because too many people would know, and the Amish still would not harbor these boys. At least that's what those local communities said to Shattered and authorities. Authorities most recently received a tip in May that was deemed very, very credible. A woman called in saying that she believed she saw John and his van parked on the side of the road by a patch of woods around the time frame that all of this was kind of happening.
So what leads us to this today? What can you tell us about?
We received a tip from an individual who had never come out with this information before, she saw a van matching John Skelton's, the description of the van he was driving, the minivan, parked on this side of the road here on Thanksgiving Day, the day before the boys went missing.
Right here?
Right here, right in this direction, yes.
And here we are, we're off the highway.
Right.
We're also up against a wooded area.
Right, we're on a main road, we're just south of Morenci where the phone tracked. The body of water here, as you see to the road, is only, maybe 30, 40 feet off the road. If John Skelton was parked here on Thanksgiving Day, this could have been an area that he was scouting.
You get so many tips.
Right.
But what is it about this that's different enough to warrant all of this?
Well, number one, this information has never come out before.
We are using both the cadaver dog as a search tool to potentially locate any type of material. Also using the side scan sonar out in this pond, attempt to locate any larger type objects in the pond, kind of also give us an idea of what the layout of the bottom looks like.
These bodies of water seem to be where a lot of things are found, whether that be evidence, the actual bodies. A lot of things can be hidden in water. If they're weighted down, they're just out of view. People aren't going to run across them. If they're hunters in the woods, if there's things like that, they're just not going to see those on a day-to-day basis.
Now, the information this woman was able to give authorities perfectly matched information that they had already found and had not released to the public, a location they already thought to be involved in the boys' disappearance. There is apparently a 14-foot deep pond in that area, and it's so possible the boys are in this location that authorities have named this location the hot zone. They brought in divers, they've used sonar, they have cadaver dogs, they've searched the pond as much as possible, they've searched the surrounding areas. There's even, I believe, a campsite nearby, but there is one piece of land that has not been searched because it is private property. That area in specific is also being looked into by a reporter named Lynn Thompson. And this man has been reporting on this case. He's known about it since it first came to light. And he has actually released an entire book called 76 Minutes that's all about his theories. Essentially, 76 minutes being the time frame where John's phone was turned off in Holiday City and whenever he ended up back home. Len strongly believes that in this time frame is when the boys were potentially disposed of or taken somewhere to be given to somebody. We don't have the answer, so we don't know which of those it is. This is pretty much an agreement upon everyone. Authorities tend to believe the same as well, but they obviously have to kind of branch out more since they do have such little information. But Lynn has an entire book on his theories. He thinks that it's very possible the area of private land that has not been searched yet holds answers, and he thinks authorities need to try to find a way to search this land. I don't think it's been searched yet. I could be missing something that has not been released. He also believes that authorities should take a deeper look into John's whereabouts that day using social media and things like that. John had a smartphone, so while the pings didn't give a lot of information, now I know if you're signed into Google, sometimes that will track your location unless you opt out of it. Instagram, Snapchat, there are many different apps that he could have had on his phone to track his location. However, I think if his phone was turned off, I don't think it would have made a difference anyways. He might have gone much further than just Holiday City, and if his phone was off, using those other apps just wouldn't be very helpful. Now on to my end thoughts. Tanya has said she believes she will eventually be reunited with her boys. She remains very hopeful in authorities' efforts to locate them. She knows they're doing everything they absolutely can. Tanya believes that John was so scared to lose custody of his boys, just like he lost custody of his daughter, that he took matters into his own hands. She thinks it's possible that their argument triggered him into acting out on his own, which makes sense in my personal opinion because it seemed like the objects again in the house were ones of importance to her or their marriage, and he was kind of letting his anger out on that. And then also the fact that he showed up in Holiday City, which apparently was a very important place for him and Tanya. Tanya's also worried that he just entirely lost track of reality. John loved like role play video games and things like that online, and he would spend hours and hours and hours playing them, and she believes that maybe he just kind of lost touch. John has just recently started speaking out again from prison, and it actually started with the Shattered podcast. John now switched things from Joanne to the underground group, to the Amish, the Mennonites, a religious group, to now he met 3 people at JD's truck stop in Niles, Michigan. Their names were apparently Sue, Virgil, and Elijah. He's openly stated that he believes these weren't their real names, and he's aware of that. But he apparently saw these people at the truck stop, and one way or another decided they were the ones who were going to get the boys. So this indicates this is something he'd been planning for a while, which also makes sense with him, you know, coming home randomly with this story about Joanne Taylor and then creating the false account. So it seemed like he was really planning this for a long time. Maybe after his trip to Florida didn't work out, he realized he'd have to figure something else out in order to get the boys away from Tanya. But the reason that doesn't make sense to me is he originally asked Tanya, obviously, to move with them all the way to Florida. So I honestly can't figure out where his mind was at in this point in time. But either way, he said that these 3 people were who he was going to hand the boys over to. He said they maintained contact for the next few months. They even came to meet the boys with other children at some points when John had them in his custody to see if they would get along with these certain children. And then he said on Thanksgiving, he fed the boys their favorite meal. They watched movies. This matches up with him saying they watched a movie and, you know, that's why the search terms were what they were on the computer. It even matches the plates that were found in the home and the meals that were on them when authorities searched the house the next day. He said that around 10 o'clock, the 3 individuals showed up to his house and they were supposed to take the boys just for the night for a trial run, but he said they never got back in contact with him again and they never brought the boys back. Johns even stated that he wonders if he was basically tricked and he handed his kids over to people with horrible intentions. But again, it's just frustrating because while there seems to be bits of truth in all of his stories that do line up with facts, he changes things so drastically that it's hard to believe something or believe him because he's just said so many different things. When the Shattered podcast was finally able to speak to John's family, they were able to add in their own opinions and things that they say have happened and their own stories, and it's a very interesting thing to hear, and in my personal opinion, sounded very, very genuine. I strongly urge all of you guys to go and listen to the podcast. I felt a very certain way, and then gears kind of changed when I heard them and what they had to say. And again, Shatter did so great at keeping things so unbiased. But John's family claims that John had actually gone to authorities prior, and he warned them and told them that his wife was abusing the boys, but they didn't do anything about it. They claimed that John called them multiple times saying he didn't know what to do, and they kept telling him to go higher up and higher up, go to the state police, go to FBI, go to whoever you need to so that they listen to you. But while they made those claims that John did in fact go and talk to authorities prior to all of this, authorities have absolutely no record that John ever came and made any sort of complaints at all. So at this point, you kind of wonder, well, did authorities just not ever make any sort of formal note about it, or did John not actually go to authorities about it? They've also said that anyone that knows John knows he would never ever harm his children. He has never been a violent person, and John's mom has said that Tanya was very, very manipulative. When they split, she would call John for things like sex and different favors, and then by the next day, she'd be, holding his kids over his head and using them against him. She would basically use the children as leverage, but keep in mind, pretty much everything in this entire case is hearsay. It's he said, she said, accusations one against the other, so it's really difficult to believe either side. John's mom and dad said that they just trust him, that they believe him fully. She said she knows her son, and when she saw him say the boys are safe and he didn't do anything to them, that she knew he wasn't lying. They also do not agree at all with what John did. They said that he made a huge mistake. They do not support his decision to hand the boys off to someone, and they said, he made his bed and now he's laying in it, and this is something that he has to live with. But they said they also understand his parents, that he was just trying to protect his children, and it it felt like he was pushed in a corner and it was the only way that he could do it. They strongly believe that once the boys turn 18, that they will come out of their hiding. A lot of people question, why would the boys keep to themselves? Andrew and Alexander, they were old enough to probably have a lot of memories. They were 9 and 7. Tanner was 5. He may have some, but probably not too many. And a lot wonder, how did these boys not get on the internet at this point and know that they're missing and want to reach out to someone and want to do this and that? But John's family pointed out, what if they're happy? What if these allegations against Tanya, despite authorities so far not finding evidence, which I do want to restate, but what if something was happening at home and now they feel much more safe and much happier? They're not going to come forward because they, at this point, know they would go right back into the hands of Tanya likely. So that's the side that John's family has put forward about this. But they do strongly believe these boys, once they all turn 18, will come and locate them. John's dad said that someone approached him down in Florida where he lives, instructed him to not turn around. They approached from behind and told him that they wanted him to know that his grandchildren were safe, and then they just vanished. Now again, if that's true or not, we don't know. So the big question is, did John do something to his boys out of anger toward Tanya, or maybe fear that he was going to lose them to her, or fear that they were being abused by her? I feel like I find it hard to believe that he would end their lives to get them away from abuse. I don't know. I mean, to me, there's a lot more other options you can take to protect children other than ending their lives over it. But we don't know his state of mind at the time. To him, that might have been the most rational thing. It's hard to say. Authorities across the board, local police, state police, and FBI have all come forward and openly said they believe that John murdered the boys. They do not believe the boys are alive anymore. Because of the fact that he tried to end his life that same day that the boys went missing, some also believe this could be a murder-suicide situation. To me, it's equally as possible that he genuinely believed he was going to hand his boys off to someone and put them in a more safe situation. But then that brings into play, there could be some random group out there that saw this as a great opportunity to traffic 3 young boys. I just find it very important to look at what John is saying. And despite his story changing so many times, the 2 things that he has never backed down from is that he handed them over to someone, and he did it because Tanya was abusing the boys. I see another aspect to this when it comes to him trying to end his own life. I think it's very possible he may have done that to try to kill the secret along with himself. Authorities don't believe he handed the boys over to the Amish. They honestly have said they don't believe that he's handed them over to anyone. John was a very narcissistic person, and he at this point seemed to not trust anybody. Look at it this way. If Joanne was going to take the boys, we know it was Joanne. She had a husband. She might have had kids. That's already a handful of people that know and could tell the secret. Then you think about this underground organization that he claims took the boys. They apparently came over multiple times to the house. I don't think he would risk that with Tanya being right down the street. They also would have told Tanya. I feel like, again, being the ages that they were, they probably would have said something, and I don't think he would have risked that either if he truly were trying to get the boys away and in safe hands. And then how many eyes? There's the 3 people plus the kids that they brought over to see if it was a compatible match. Authorities believe that John and John alone is the one who knows what happened to the boys and if they were given to someone or if he did something to them. And I definitely think that's possible. However, I also think it's hugely possible that in that hour and 16 minutes he had, it could have been a person-to-person handover, and that's that. John has claimed many times as well that the boys are now living on the Ohio-Indiana border and that they are living at a farm there where they have plenty of space to run and play and grow up, living the life that he wanted them to live. I have looked it up, and it takes about an hour to get to the Ohio-Indiana border. I strongly believe it's very possible it was just John and either a couple or, one person, potentially a small family that he could have been in contact with. Maybe he put the boys in the car that morning and he drove all the way to the Ohio-Indiana border. Maybe by the time he reached Holiday City, he realized that he hadn't turned his phone off and he could be tracked. So from there, he just drove to the border, exchanged the boys over. It wouldn't have been a long, drawn-out process anyways, because if this is what happened, you wouldn't want to be seen in this situation. So he could have easily made it back in the time frame that we have here. It's very, very possible. And then again, maybe him coming back and trying to end his life was him kind of ending his side to the secret. Maybe he trusted these people to keep the boys safe, and he wanted to take himself out of the equation to protect them even further. So I personally believe that is a huge possibility, but there is still such a massive possibility the boys are no longer alive. I don't think there is any sign of blood or anything like that from the boys that was within the home. But if you look at his searches, rat poisoning, that can kill without blood. He easily could have gotten rid of that in that early morning drive, so there was no evidence of it. Again, breaking someone's neck with your hands, that also could go without leaving any blood anywhere. So I don't necessarily think no sign of blood or anything in the home equates to the boys being fine. It just could go so many different ways, and I've done nothing but sit for days and just look at maps and think and put myself in the shoes of someone else. And what drives me so insane is knowing that right now, John is sitting in prison and knows exactly what happened, and he won't say anything. You know, I do believe parts of what he's saying are true. I honestly do. Because when you lie, you tend to sprinkle in truth to remember your lies easier. And then I think from there, he just was sending people on a wild goose chase. I also think the fact that his first person he went to was this Joanne Taylor, and she's literally the exact opposite direction of where he seemed to be heading that morning. I don't know. He had some sort of plan that had been in place for at least 2 or 3 months at that point, and I think things kind of got sped up when that phone call happened with Tanya, and I don't know what happened from there. Nobody does, or we might know where the boys are today. I honestly just feel like we're missing something. To me, there seems to be some puzzle piece that's missing just from the general story, not necessarily the boys' disappearance, whether it was something that was going on between Tanya and John. I don't know. Something big to me is missing, because obviously, Tanya's history is concerning, especially having 3 boys of her own. But there is absolutely no evidence at all to prove that she did anything, and authorities have checked everything they possibly can other than the boys physically themselves. But it's strange to me that this all of a sudden became an issue when Tanya didn't want to move to Florida. So I feel like there's just something in that mix right there that we're not getting. I have all the faith in the world that authorities are going to solve this. I wish that every single missing persons case and unsolved murder was treated with the same sort of attention by authorities. Larry Weeks, even though he doesn't even work at the same police department anymore, Shattered went and spoke to him. He still, in this different department, has the missing poster up of the boys. Everyone is so dedicated to it. They literally all came and sat around for a documentary that was done on it. I have that link down below. Everyone wants to find these boys and bring them home. And it's just heartbreaking, because I feel like there's just so much anger and, frustration and finger pointing. It just breaks my heart, because all I can think is that these 3 boys probably have absolutely no idea. All I can think about is that these 3 boys, completely innocent, were taken, and something was done with them because of issues that 2 adults seem to be having. And it just breaks my freaking heart, because there's no telling what their quality of life has been since then, if they're even still alive. And they didn't ask for any of this to happen to them. Whatever did happen to them, they didn't ask for any of it, and they didn't deserve any of it. And it just, quite frankly, as a mother, pisses me off and is so wildly upsetting. I hope that these boys are eventually reunited with their family. They have so many people that, love them and care for them. That's half the reason why everyone is so angry and all this finger pointing and all this is happening to begin with, is just because these aunts and uncles and grandparents and mothers and fathers, they just love the boys and they just want them home. There was an event on December the 3rd, which was another reason why I really wanted to have the video up last week, but unfortunately it didn't happen. On December 3rd, a handful of students, college students from Adrian College in Michigan, premiered a documentary that they made about the Skelton brothers. They spent a long time putting it together, and it's called Without Wax, A Story of True Evil. And I'm sure you're wondering, without wax, what the heck does that mean? Apparently, when John finally started opening up to people through emails and letters, he always signed it without wax. And if you're not aware of what that term means, it boils down to like authentic, without being altered or fixed or anything. When a sculptor is creating their sculpture, if they get any nicks or dings or anything, they usually fill it with wax to seal the imperfections. And John was signing everything without wax lately, as in he was telling the truth and he was, saying things how they were. The documentary was only being shown December 3rd at the historic Croswell Opera House in Michigan. I do not know if it will be released anywhere else. I have not seen them release it anywhere else. I'm hoping it's somewhere eventually. I'm going to try to get in contact with them. But it was really awesome what they did, because all proceeds from the tickets and everything went straight to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And you guys, creating YouTube videos is hard, but making a whole documentary, the travel, the equipment, the time, everything that they put into this, they did all of that simply to help the boys and to donate everything to organizations like NCMEC that try to bring children like this home, which I think is absolutely awesome. So on that note, you guys, that is all I have. I am going to remember this for the rest of my life. I've had nightmares over these boys and where they are and what might have happened to them, and all of the he said, she said, and stories and things changing. And honestly, I hope you guys come up with some great theories down below. I'm sure authorities hopefully will see this and maybe go through the comments. And as always, information is listed down below if you have any information on the whereabouts of the Skelton brothers, or if you saw anything at all over that Thanksgiving in Morenci, Michigan, or any of the locations that I mentioned. Authorities have worked hand in hand really close with everyone, every reporter, anyone trying to help out with this, which is another thing that I appreciate. And hopefully someone brings something forward that brings these boys home, or at least brings answers to the family who has just been sitting here in this mess for a decade now. On that note, you guys, I'm going to go ahead and go. Thank you so much for being patient with me and letting me get the story out. I honestly could go on and on and on, probably for hours at this point, with theories and more information that I heard in the podcast, but I will let you guys go ahead and speak about theories down below and listen to the podcast yourself. There's a lot in there that I couldn't manage to fit into this, and that was, really hard work they did on their part that I didn't feel comfortable kind of repeating, being not my own work, if that makes sense. Like basically the interviews and things like that, it's just important to me. And hearing the way that John's family speaks about everything, and hearing the way that Tanya speaks about things in her own words, it's just something that's very important to me that you guys should support. But I want to thank you guys so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to the story about these boys and hear about not just their disappearance, but who they were and the people that missed them and everything in between. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button to become a part of the Hallen fam, so hopefully we can help bring them home together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.
This past summer, John Skelton Sr., his wife Roxanne, and daughter Lucinda went to visit John in prison. After that visit, they said they would never go back. Skelton says he feels John isn't sharing everything he knows.
He's hiding information. Well, I'm not gonna say he's not telling the truth, but I think he's telling the truth. But the truth, the whole story of things concerned, he's hiding.
This is much different than what we heard from Skelton Sr. back when we visited the family at their home in Jacksonville in October of last year.
I don't care how drastic things could have gotten in his mind. He would have not hurt the boys.
There were things, bits and pieces I'd heard in the past, but when you sit back and objectively look at what he is saying and some of these other pieces that happened that were coincidental, they might have been strictly coincidental to this particular situation, but he wasn't aware that they happened. And I says, okay, I'm gonna put together my pitch to him, and I did. I voiced my opinions and things back and forth, and basically I told him it's time to put the whole story out there not just bits and pieces that are probably the truth, perceived to be the truth, but you've got to put the whole story out there, and until that happens, and Mr. Brewer and I are up here to see you make that, happen. I probably won't see you again. I guess the last visit she had with him, his sister went up there too, and the sister, Lou, she kind of, I guess, walked out on him also. He's stubborn in some respects, and I think he's scared in other respects, and he wasn't gonna open up to me with other things about it, of which, if he had, I think we could have cleared up a lot of things and gotten a lot of extra help, but he wasn't ready to do it at that point. When I walked out of the room, I guess he kind of started to break down a little bit about the whole thing. I think I will end up talking to him again if the conditions are right and he has come to his senses and is willing to do what I think is going to have to be done on this whole situation. Then I will be there with the state officials, and we will sit down as a conference and go from there.
There's no one out there that really believes his story truly. Does that help me? Absolutely, because it does kind of back him into a corner. At the end of the day, this case is very simple. John was their dad. He was with them the night that they went missing. And whatever we can do for him to make him feel comfortable enough to trust us, I'm willing to do it.
I felt like I was running out of options, and I wasn't going to leave my kids. I just did the wrong thing.
When you say you did the wrong thing, what do you mean? You should have chosen...
I should not have done what I did. I should have just lost my voice.
What do you mean?
Well, I should have just lived without my boys, and probably would have been the best thing to go to Florida and to deal with it. I did the wrong thing for the right reasons, the wrong way.
So how would
It's
you...
one of those things that at the time I was willing to pay the price, so I did.